So we've got a massive stack of sources in front of us today for this deep dive. I mean, we are looking at thousands of pages of biographical notes, archival interviews, behind-the-scenes logs, all of it.
Yeah, there's a ton of historical retrospectives to get through.
Right, and as I was sifting through all this material, a really specific image just kept jumping out at me. Like, usually when we think about a camera, we think of it as an instrument for connection, you know?
Definitely. It's generally understood as a mechanism for preserving a moment so you can share it. It's an inherently social tool.
Exactly. You point a lens at a family reunion or a wedding, and you are instantly part of a shared human experience. But then you dive into the childhood of arguably the most famous filmmaker in the history of the medium, and suddenly that camera is doing the exact opposite.
Right, it's not a tool for connection at all in his case.
No, it's a wall. It is a literal physical barrier being placed between a scared, highly sensitive, bullied kid and a world that he feels completely alienated from.
It becomes this intense defense mechanism, a way to control and dictate reality rather than just passively document it.
And that transformation, I mean, from using a camera to hide from the world to using a camera to force the entire world to feel what he was feeling, that is the mission of today's deep dive.
It really is a remarkable trajectory to unpack.
Today on Roll Credits, the spotlight is on Steven Spielberg, the kid who started making movies at home and grew up to define what a blockbuster even is.
And to really understand the cinema that redefined global entertainment for all of us, we have to start with the environment that built the boy.
Right, so let's get into it. He's born in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1946. Over the next decade or so, the family moves to New Jersey, and then they eventually relocate out west to Arizona.
But what strikes me when looking through these biographical sources isn't the geography of his childhood. It's the intense, almost irreconcilable psychological geography inside his own home.
Oh, man, yeah. I'm looking at the profiles of his parents, and it honestly reads like a sitcom pitch about polar opposites.
It really does. You have his father, Arnold, who's an electrical engineer. He's a workaholic, a World War II veteran, and his brain is entirely wired for logic.
Right. Logic, mechanics, early computer technology. Arnold is the ultimate pragmatist.
Exactly. And then literally directly across the kitchen table, you have his mother, Leah. She was a former concert pianist who essentially put her artistic career on hold for the family.
And Spielberg himself has described his mom as having this sort of Peter Pan personality. She was impulsive, fiercely artistic, and she basically refused to let go of her own childlike wonder.
It's like having an artificial intelligence programmer and a bohemian poet trying to co-pilot the same household.
Yeah, and growing up in that environment, Stephen is just soaking up both of these extreme polarities. He's getting the mechanical precision from his dad and the boundless imagination from his mom.
But beyond the parental clash, there's a much heavier, darker layer to his childhood that we really need to establish to understand his mind.
We absolutely do. The Spielbergs are an Orthodox Jewish family, and Stephen is born just one single year after the end of the Holocaust.
Right, so the shadow of that atrocity wasn't just a history lesson for him. It was a physical presence in their living room. His family had lost numerous relatives in Poland and Ukraine.
And when they were living in Ohio, Stephen's grandmother actively taught English to Holocaust survivors who had immigrated to the U.S. There's one specific anecdote in the sources that is just impossible to shake.
The counting story.
Yes. There was a survivor who came to the house, and he actually taught a 3-year-old Stephen how to count by pointing to the numbers tattooed on his own arm from Auschwitz.
Wow.
The man would roll up his sleeve, point to a 6, bend his elbow to distort the skin, and say, now it's a 9, it's a magic trick.
I mean, just sit with the psychological weight of that for a second. You have a toddler absorbing the absolute darkest trauma of human history as a parlor trick.
Long before he possesses the cognitive ability to grasp what those numbers actually mean.
Exactly. The baseline of his reality is built on a foundation of profound generational trauma. And then the family moves to Arizona.
Right. And that Jewish identity, which is already so tied to tragedy in his mind, suddenly becomes a source of acute daily alienation. They were often the only Jewish family in their neighborhood.
The sources are very clear about how isolating this was. He was a skinny, highly sensitive, unathletic kid dropped into a suburban community dominated by Gentile jocks.
He was bullied mercilessly. Classmates literally called him Spielbug. They would kick dirt in his face. He frequently came home with bloody noses.
Which brings us right back to the camera.
Yeah.
Because if you are a kid who feels completely powerless, how do you survive?
You put an 8mm camera up to your eye, It's a shield. The moment you look through that viewfinder, you put a physical piece of machinery between yourself and the people who are hurting you.
Right? You aren't the victim anymore. You are the director. You decide what stays in the frame, and you decide what gets cut.
That is the exact mechanism of his early survival. The camera gave him agency. And we see this deep-seated need to control overwhelming fear manifest incredibly early, like in 1952.
Yeah, when Steven is just 6 years old, his parents take him to see his very first movie in a theater. It's Cecil B. DeMille's The Greatest Show on Earth.
But his parents made a massive unforced error here. They told him they were going to the circus.
Right, so he goes in expecting clowns and cotton candy. He thinks it's a literal circus tent.
Instead, he is plunged into the dark and he watches a massive, terrifying, hyper-realistic train crash sequence unfold on a giant glowing screen. It completely traumatizes him.
Well, he's 6 years old, and he's watching metal twist and explode at a scale he's never experienced. But his response to that trauma is fascinating.
Totally. By the time he's 12, he is taking his expensive Lionel toy trains, and he is intentionally crashing them into each other in his bedroom over and over again.
He is recreating the exact cinematic trauma he witnessed. It's this psychological loop where he shrinks the terrifying chaos of the world down to a manageable size.
But it was actually his mother, Leah, who provided the crucial pivot. Because he was destroying these expensive toys, she suggested he film the crash with his dad's 8mm camera.
That way, he could watch the destruction as many times as he wanted without breaking the trains. By filming the crash, he was processing the fear on his own terms.
So how does a childhood coping mechanism evolve into a legitimate passion? It officially starts with the Boy Scouts.
Spielberg wanted to earn a photography merit badge, but his father's still camera was broken at the time. So Arnold suggested his son use the motion picture camera instead.
Which led to Spielberg directing a 9-minute 8mm Western called The Last Gunfight in 1958. And when he showed that short film to his scout troop, something clicked.
He watched the reaction of his peers. He felt the thrill they got from his work. For a kid who'd been kicked around, realizing he could manipulate their emotions was an intoxicating rush of power.
It was an absolute revelation. But beneath this newfound superpower, there was a hidden struggle that makes his pivot to visual storytelling so much more profound.
We are talking about a man who would eventually read thousands of scripts and manage massive productions. But as a child, he was dealing with severe, undiagnosed dyslexia.
This is one of the most vital pieces of context in the entire stack. He wasn't officially diagnosed until he was 60 years old.
60? That's unbelievable.
Right. As a kid in the 1950s, he was reading 2 full grade levels behind his classmates. He lived in absolute dread of being called on to read out loud in class.
The letters would literally swim and jumble on the page. Even as an adult, he admits that it takes him nearly 3 hours to read a standard 120-page script.
Which would normally take an industry professional maybe an hour. And because the educational system back then had virtually no understanding of dyslexia, school administrators just mislabeled him.
They called him lazy. They assumed he just wasn't applying himself. Imagine the compounded shame of that.
Exactly. You are already feeling alienated because of your heritage. You were getting physically bullied. And now you are being publicly shamed by your teachers.
It creates a perfect storm of isolation. And it perfectly explains why he would reject the written word entirely and flock toward images.
He couldn't control the letters on a page, so they betrayed him. But he could absolutely speak the language of cinema. It became his authentic mode of communication.
And it gave him incredible confidence. When he was in 7th grade, he decided to make a 40-minute World War II film called Escape to Nowhere. And he actually cast his primary high school bully in the movie.
It is the ultimate power move.
It's genius. If you make the bully the star of your movie, he can't beat you up anymore.
One of his classmates later said how surreal it was to watch this skinny kid barking orders at the football players, and they were eagerly following his commands.
The second he stepped onto a set, he transformed from a victim into the undisputed leader. And we really have to credit his parents here for supporting him.
Yeah, as much as Arnold and Leah clashed, they completely enabled his obsession. Arnold provided the camera equipment and even used his veteran connections to get grounded B-51 fighter planes for a set.
Meanwhile, Leah is actively subverting authority. She's writing fake sick notes to the school so Steven can stay home and edit his footage. She was his biggest cheerleader.
Their combined support culminated in his first truly ambitious project in 1964. At just 17 years old, he makes a 140-minute sci-fi epic called Firelight.
It made for roughly $500, mostly funded by his dad. It was a story about a quiet town terrorized by strange alien UFOs.
Which, of course, is the direct thematic precursor to Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And he actually manages to rent out a local theater in Phoenix to screen it.
500 people showed up, they paid $1 a ticket, and he ended up yielding exactly $1 in profit.
Which technically makes it his first commercially successful feature film, but he also had a legendary encounter around this time that fundamentally altered his craft.
Right, his meeting with John Ford. Spielberg essentially sneaks his way into an office building in L.A. and finds himself face-to-face with the legendary director of The Searchers.
This is one of the greatest Hollywood anecdotes ever. Ford gives this teenage kid a piece of advice that is so brutally simple, but it dictates the entire emotional weight of a shot.
Ford asked him to look at the paintings on his office wall and describe where the horizon was.
And Ford tells him, when you're able to distinguish the art of the horizon at the bottom of a frame or at the top of a frame, you might make a good picture maker. But if the horizon is dead center, it's boring.
Let's explain why that is, because it's pure psychology. If you put the horizon dead center, the frame is perfectly balanced, and perfect balance equals zero tension.
Precisely. If you place a high horizon, meaning mostly Earth, and just a sliver of sky, the subject feels trapped or oppressed.
And conversely, a low horizon makes the subject look heroic and liberated against the heavens.
Yeah.
Spielberg absorbed that entirely.
It taught him that where you place the camera dictates how you feel about the subject before a single word is spoken. But eventually, this backyard cinematic world couldn't shield him from reality.
Right. The differences between Arnold and Leah finally reached a breaking point, and his parents' marriage fell apart.
The divorce was a devastating trauma. And for years, Steven placed the blame squarely on his father. He believed Arnold had simply abandoned the family for his work.
He wouldn't learn the actual truth for decades. So a deeply wounded teenage Steven moved to Los Angeles with his dad. He was hurting and threw himself entirely into the work.
He starts attending college, but he's incredibly restless. So in 1968, he directs a highly polished 35mm short film called Amblin.
It's a 26-minute film about a boy and a girl hitchhiking, and Amblin becomes his golden ticket. A copy finds its way to Sidney Sheinberg, the VP of production for Universal Television.
Sheinberg is so blown away that he immediately offers the 22-year-old Spielberg a 7-year television directing contract.
Spielberg basically dropped out of college overnight to sign it.
He joked that he quit school so fast he didn't even bother cleaning out his locker. But let me push back on this a little bit because context is everything here. We're talking about the late 1960s and early 70s. This is the absolute peak of the American New Wave. Guys like Scorsese, Coppola, and De Palma are making these gritty, experimental masterpieces.
The Hollywood Renaissance. Yeah.
Exactly. They are breaking all the rules. Meanwhile, Steven Spielberg is wearing a suit and tie, stuck on a Universal backlot directing network medical dramas. Was that actually an advantage?
It wasn't just an advantage, it was arguably the defining crucible that made him the most successful director of his generation. Television was his paid film school.
How so? Because TV at that time was notoriously formulaic.
Exactly, because it was formulaic. Working in 70s TV taught him ruthless discipline. It taught him how to shoot fast, stay on budget, and make mediocre scripts visually interesting.
And most importantly, it made him hyper-aware of audience retention. Because if a movie gets boring, the audience is already in the theater, they probably won't walk out.
But if a TV show gets boring, they just turn the dial and change the channel. Spielberg learned the exact rhythm required to keep a viewer's eyes glued to the screen.
And crucially, he treated television like cinema, which actually deeply annoyed a lot of the old-school TV crews. They wanted flat master shots, and he wanted complex dolly moves.
And he proved himself quickly. In 1969, at just 22, he directed a segment of Night Gallery starring Joan Crawford.
Imagine being 22, crashing toy trains just a few years prior, and now you're directing Golden Age royalty. And then in 1971, he directs an iconic episode of Columbo, Murder by the Book.
He was injecting standard TV with cinematic tension, which perfectly sets the stage for his major breakthrough, the 1971 made-for-TV movie Duel.
Duel is incredible. It proved he wasn't just a reliable TV journeyman, but an absolute prodigy. The premise is primal. A salesman driving through the desert gets relentlessly terrorized by a massive, rusted tanker truck.
You never see the driver's face. It is pure Hitchcockian suspense on asphalt. And the production constraints were insane. He was given roughly 10 days to shoot the entire film.
Standard operating procedure would have been to use rear projection on a soundstage, where the actor sits in a fake car and they project the road behind them.
Right, which looks notoriously fake and shatters the illusion of danger. But Spielberg flat out refused. He insisted on shooting out on actual highways in the scorching desert.
And they pulled it off. They even rigged the truck with a dead clutch so that when it finally goes over a cliff at the end, it lurches and stalls like it's fighting for its life.
The truck becomes an animal.
Yeah.
He even added this low, booming roar sound effect to its descent, taking the death roar from the 1954 film Creature of the Black Lagoon.
Duel was such a masterpiece of tension that it actually got a theatrical release in Europe. It proved he could handle action, but he still needed to prove he could handle complex human emotion.
And he did exactly that with his first true theatrical feature, The Sugarland Express, in 1974, based on a true story about a fugitive couple trying to get their baby back from foster care.
This movie is monumental for two reasons. First, it formally introduces his defining thematic obsession, the broken family. It's the trauma of his parents' divorce manifesting on screen.
And second, it marks his very first collaboration with composer John Williams.
It is impossible to overstate the importance of that meeting. Spielberg was a young kid in his 20s, sitting at a restaurant, literally singing Williams's previous scores right to his face.
That lunch sparked a 50-year partnership. So he's proved he can do visceral suspense with Duel and emotional drama with Sugarland, which lands him the job that changes the industry forever.
1975, Jaws.
Jaws is the watershed moment. He is hired to adapt Peter Benchley's best-selling novel about a rogue great white shark. They hired him specifically because of Duel.
A truck on a highway, a shark in the ocean. It's the exact same terrifying geometry. But the production of Jaws was like an absolute nightmare.
They made the fateful decision to shoot on the actual open ocean at Martha's Vineyard. They built this massive mechanical shark nicknamed Bruce after his lawyer.
And Bruce, it turns out, violently hates the salt water.
He really did. The salt water corroded the mechanics. Bruce constantly broke down or sank to the bottom. A scheduled 55-day shoot ballooned into an agonizing 159 days.
Spielberg was convinced his career was over. But here is where his TV background kicks in. This is the ultimate example of cinematic misdirection.
Because the shark wasn't working, he adopted a Hitchcockian less is more approach. By hiding the shark, he forced the audience's own imagination to do the work.
Think about it. Imagine how comical Jaws would be if, in minute 10, Spielberg showed us a stiff, rubbery, malfunctioning fake shark floating in the water.
It would be a B-movie creature feature. But instead, it becomes a psychological thriller. He uses brilliant point-of-view shots from underwater, making you feel like the predator.
And the yellow barrels. You don't see the shark, you just see 3 yellow barrels racing across the surface, and it is terrifying.
He relied heavily on his editor, Verna Fields, to cut the film with surgical precision. And the chaotic production actually fostered brilliant improvisation, like Roy Scheider's famous line,
"You're going to need a bigger boat." Which was actually an inside joke among the crew about their own tiny production barge.
And we have to mention the vertigo zoom, when Chief Brody is on the beach and realizes an attack is happening.
The dolly zoom, yeah. The camera physical rolls backwards on tracks while the operators zoom in. So Brody's size stays the same, but the background appears to violently rush forward.
It perfectly simulates the feeling of a sudden panic attack. And of course, the ultimate tension comes from John Williams.
Williams plays him this primal 2-note theme on the piano, E and F, dad-dum, dad-dum, and Spielberg literally laughed. He thought Williams was pulling his leg.
But Williams explained that those 2 notes could manipulate the audience's impression of the water even when they couldn't see the shark. The music literally became the shark.
So what is the aftermath of Jaws? It becomes the first movie in history to gross $100 million. It essentially invents the modern summer blockbuster and the wide release strategy.
It made moviegoing a national synchronized event. But there was a real-world consequence that Spielberg deeply regrets to this day.
Yes, the film sparked a massive public panic about sharks, which directly led to a surge in trophy shark hunting. It devastated the global great white population.
Spielberg has spoken very openly about his guilt over that. But professionally, the success of Jaws handed him a blank check.
He had unprecedented leverage, and he chose to turn his eyes from the terrifying ocean to the wonder of the stars. Moving into his golden era of the late 70s to the mid-80s.
He tackles Close Encounters of the Third Kind in 1977, the massive realization of his childhood film Firelight. And then, 1941, Raiders of the Lost Ark, E.T., and Temple of Doom.
I want to focus on Close Encounters and E.T. for a second because they are basically two sides of the same coin. In Close Encounters, the father is so obsessed with the aliens that he literally abandons his family to get on the mothership.
And this ties directly back to his childhood trauma. It's a reflection of Spielberg trying to understand his own father, who he still believed had selfishly walked out on the family.
But let me interrupt here because honestly, isn't that ending incredibly dark? A guy just abandons his small children to go on a space joyride.
It is deeply dark. And Spielberg has admitted he would never write that ending today. He wrote it when he was young and single. Once he had kids, his perspective completely changed.
Which brings us perfectly to E.T. just 5 years later. If Close Encounters is about a father leaving, E.T. is about the emotional wreckage left behind.
Right, the alien in E.T. is essentially an imaginary friend who arrives to help a little boy survive the trauma of his father already being gone.
And musically, John Williams is right there. For E.T.'s final chase, Spielberg actually let Williams conduct the orchestra purely on emotion, and then Spielberg re-edited the visual footage to match the music.
That is the ultimate level of artistic trust. And while making these deeply personal films, he's also reinventing the action genre with his friend George Lucas.
The origin story of Raiders is wild. They were on a beach in Hawaii building sandcastles. Spielberg says he wants to direct a James Bond movie, and Lucas pitches him Indiana Jones.
Raiders was an absolute triumph, but the sequel, Temple of Doom in 1984, was significantly darker and more violent.
It had scenes of a cult leader pulling a beating heart out of a man's chest. Parents were outraged. It was too violent for PG, but not adult enough for R.
Exactly. Spielberg actually suggested a middle ground to the Motion Picture Association, which literally led to the creation of the PG-13 rating.
But Temple of Doom was also pivotal because he met the lead actress, Kate Capshaw. She would become his wife, and she profoundly grounded him.
By the mid-'80s, Spielberg was the undisputed king of entertainment. But internally, the entertainer label felt like a cage. He wanted serious validation.
So he takes a massive risk with The Color Purple in 1985, a complex story about the generational suffering of African-American women in the South. No aliens, no special effects.
He follows it up with Empire of the Sun in 1987, about a British boy in a Japanese internment camp. Both films deal with the violent loss of innocence.
But this transition into serious filmmaking wasn't totally smooth. In 1991, we get Hook, which has a massive nostalgic fan base today, but critically it's considered a creative slump.
It reflects a dark transitional period in his personal life. He was navigating a divorce from his first wife, Amy Irving.
And the theme of Hook is so on the nose. Peter Pan grows up into a ruthless, workaholic lawyer who neglects his kids. Spielberg was terrified of becoming what he resented his father for.
But his personal life stabilizes when he marries Kate Capshaw. And before they married, Kate underwent a formal conversion to Judaism.
Which had a profound impact on him. Seeing her embrace the faith prompted him to reconnect with the exact heritage that had caused him so much pain as a kid.
They kept a kosher kitchen, ensured his children had a Jewish education. He was finally embracing his identity, which sets the stage for 1993.
1993 is arguably the greatest, most exhausting single year any filmmaker has ever had. He releases Jurassic Park in June and Schindler's List in December.
The logistics alone are staggering. By day, he is revolutionizing CGI with genetically engineered dinosaurs. By night, he is in freezing Poland directing a harrowing film about the Holocaust.
It's like existing in two entirely different universes simultaneously. Jurassic Park seamlessly blended CGI with Stan Winster's practical animatronics, changing blockbusters forever.
And Schindler's List was the profound emotional reckoning he had been avoiding for a decade. He actually turned the script down 10 years earlier because he didn't feel mature enough.
He had to become a father and reconnect with his roots first. The result is devastatingly beautiful, shot handheld, in black and white, like a documentary.
And John Williams wrote this impossibly delicate violin score, played by Itzhak Perlman. When Williams saw a rough cut, he was so moved, he told Spielberg, "You need a better composer than I am for this film."
And Spielberg said, "I know, but they're all dead." That gives me chills. And following the film's release, Spielberg founded the USC Shoah Foundation to record survivor testimonies.
It was his way of ensuring that the history he heard about from that survivor with the tattoo would never be forgotten. Moving into the late 90s, he enters a new era.
He becomes a mogul co-founding DreamWorks. And under this banner, he directs Saving Private Ryan in 1998, which is a tribute to his father's World War II stories.
The opening 20 minutes recreating the Omaha Beach landing completely changed how war is depicted on film. He stripped the shutter angle to make the explosions look hyperkinetic and terrifying.
And anchoring that chaos is Tom Hanks. This is the start of a massive collaboration. Hanks possesses this undeniable everyman quality that grounds Spielberg's grand visions.
They team up again for Catch Me If You Can in 2002, a breezy caper on the surface, but psychologically it's about a boy trying to fix his broken family through grand illusions.
Frank Abagnale Jr. genuinely believes that if he steals enough money, he can glue his parents' marriage back together. It's pure Spielberg.
He also directs sci-fi like AI Artificial Intelligence and Minority Report. But as the 21st century progressed, the real world grew darker, and so did his films.
The post-9/11 era shifted his storytelling. Look at War of the Worlds in 2005. It is the polar opposite of Close Encounters.
In Close Encounters, the aliens are benevolent, and the father leaves. In War of the Worlds, the aliens are malevolent exterminators, and Tom Cruise's character has a primal mission to protect his kids.
It shows Spielberg's evolution from a child of divorce to a fiercely protective father. The film is saturated with haunting refugee imagery, drawing visual parallels to Schindler's List.
That same year, he releases Munich. It's a tense historical thriller based on the Israeli government's secret mission to track down the perpetrators of the 1972 Olympics tragedy.
And it approaches this fraught geopolitical subject not as an action movie, but as a morally complex exploration of the cyclical nature of violence and vengeance.
As he moves into his 60s and 70s, Spielberg pivots heavily toward historical, dialogue-driven dramas celebrating institutional integrity.
Like Lincoln in 2012, Bridge of Spies in 2015, and The Post in 2017, films about individuals navigating corrupt systems to do what is objectively right.
Interestingly, Bridge of Spies is a rare anomaly because it wasn't scored by John Williams, who was recovering from surgery. Thomas Newman stepped in and delivered a beautiful score.
He even fulfills a childhood dream by directing West Side Story in 2021, dedicated to his late father. But then, in 2022, we get The Fabelmans.
After nearly 50 years of hiding his childhood trauma inside movies about aliens and dinosaurs, he finally takes the mask off.
The Fabelmans is a direct, semi-autobiographical film. The young boy uses a camera to process the instability of his eccentric family. But the most crucial revelation is the truth about his parents' divorce.
For his entire life, Steven blamed his father for abandoning them. It fueled the themes of half his movies. But he essentially learned that it was actually his mother, Leah, who wanted to leave.
Because she had fallen deeply in love with his father's best friend. And his father, Arnold, willingly took the blame. He allowed himself to be the villain to protect Leah's fragile nature.
It is an act of incredible, quiet sacrifice. The Fabelmans was Spielberg's ultimate therapeutic endeavor to make peace with his parents and forgive their human flaws.
It brings his life's work full circle. The camera isn't just a shield anymore, it's a tool for radical empathy. He evolved from a terrified kid hiding behind a lens into a man using art to heal his deepest wounds.
It's the ultimate testament to the power of visual storytelling.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a provocative thought. We talked about how his severe dyslexia made reading a source of profound pain and shame. Is it possible that this painful struggle was actually the greatest gift cinema ever received? If words had been easy for him, he might never have been forced to communicate entirely through images. He might never have needed to become the most fluent speaker of visual language in Hollywood history.
Sometimes the exact thing that makes us an outsider is the exact thing that gives us our superpower.
And that wraps our spotlight on Steven Spielberg. If you enjoyed this breakdown, follow Roll Credits and share it with someone who loves movies as much as you do. And if there's a director or actor you think we should break down next, let us know.